This is where I always earn the reputation of Mr. Alberta. Again, I'm agnostic. We just look at what's happening in Alberta, and it continues to be a shining star amongst all of our provinces. And that is, by the way, not to negate the economic strength of both Saskatchewan and Manitoba within their housing market. Affordability, deals being done, cash flow, all of those things in both Saskatchewan and Manitoba are there. We don't talk a lot about it because ultimately we look at Alberta and we say, with what's going on economically right now, Alberta continues to be the place to invest. Now, we've qualified it, we've quantified it many times over now 5 years. We've been talking about what's going on in Alberta. I still am going to put some cautionary notes always about what's happening in Calgary. The market is into a kind of a boom cycle, and this is where mistakes get made. I'm going to caution you to make sure you're buying for cash flow, you're paying attention to property type, and you're looking into the future and watching what's happening, unfolding economically in Alberta. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've seen in the past few months, the past few years, actually, and oil production in Alberta. Year to date continues to rise. We're into record levels of oil production. Now, on the surface, some may be saying, okay, yeah, well, a classic Alberta boom bust cycle, oil's going to crash given the slowdown globally. I want to just point out something here, is that I called for higher oil and I've been wrong, and I've been wrong for lots of reasons, but not the least of which is China data earlier this year was actually pretty robust. Now we're seeing is that China is slowing down. We're seeing what happens with all of the potential global World War IIIs. I mean, there's at least 3 or 4 scenarios unfolding right now. What is that going to do to oil? Well, it's going to slow the economy down, which then in fact means that the demand will decrease. We're seeing oil prices come down. I don't know. I keep looking at it and watching it, and I think oil is going to end up still being strong towards the end of the year. Depending on what happens with the wars, well, who knows how that's going to unfold. We look at what's happening in Iran and the fight between Iran, Israel, Lebanon is now in, Middle East. I mean, it's so convoluted. Why am I even ranting on this a little bit? Because it's going to have an impact on oil, which will have an impact on the Alberta economy. This is a cautionary note. Right now, oil production is record high. That could come off rather quickly depending on what's happening. All to say this is that we watch these and we look at what it means to Canada economically. And you can see here by these charts, if you look at the chart on the left, share of natural resources in Canadian nominal GDP, you see the huge spike since 2020. Of course, that's when we were shut down. But even go back to 2016. Here's the point that you should pay attention to. When we look at what happened in 2002, 13, 14, we saw this big spike up. And when we look at that big spike up, and then ultimately things slow down, and what we know happened in Alberta's economy back then, everything came to a screeching halt. So when we look at this big spike up, everybody's really optimistic. I'm shining a light on it, is that we could go back here, given what's happening in a global picture, especially given the potential for a World War III. Now, when we come over to here, the contribution to Canada's natural resources GDP in 2022, 38.2%, 23 and 24, although the data isn't in, anecdotally, the trend has continued. So all good news for Alberta right now, but when you start to see just how big a factor it is, not just in Alberta's economy, but in Canada's economy, we got to watch those oil prices, because in Alberta, if we follow a cycle, we have to know that things could pull off, which is all to say this: buy for cash flow, buy the right property. Demand continues to stay high as immigration floods into this country, and certainly because of affordability, continues to flood into Alberta. So in amongst the chaos, we'll continue to be cautious optimism and opportunity for real estate investors who are paying attention to the details. Now, speaking of Alberta, we often ask,
why are insurance rates so high?
Well, in your postal code, they may be high, and especially if you're in a postal code that annually gets hit by hail. another hailstorm in Calgary over the past weekend, and damage was extensive. Cars trashed, windows trashed, siding trashed. So when we look at insurance and we say,
Well, I haven't even put in a claim.
what people forget is that insurance is now become, and this is a new phenomena, relatively new phenomena, you're insured and the cost of your insurance is literally by postal code. So when you look at the fires of Fort McMurray, the floods of southern Alberta, the hail damage consistently in Calgary, these postal codes are paying a premium because insurance companies are tired of paying out. Can you imagine the claims that are flooding in this week after a weekend of giant hail? You can see by this picture, some of this stuff is bigger than a golf ball, more like a hard ball, as in baseball. And these are the challenges that that particular postal code in Calgary face, because this is an annual event almost. So if you're wondering why insurance rates are there because you haven't put a claim in, well, you're paying for everybody's damage. And that's just the way the insurance rolls. So thanks for listening to REIN It In, episode number 45. When we look at all of the bad news out there, we have to consider that within the bad news lives the opportunity. Stay liquid, buy for cash flow, make sure you're looking at the right investment deals, take your time, surround yourself with the right team. There's no doubt that when we look at Canada's economy, there's still some discussion. Are we in a recession? Is it going to be a soft landing? Is it going to be a hard landing? However you create your thesis, understand that the decisions you make today have to play into that thesis. So if you see a hard landing, make sure that you're perhaps putting more money down on the deals. Make sure that you're buying the right property type. Think it through in terms of where you're investing your capital. Real estate is still a store of value. I can't stress that enough. Given monetary policy, given what's happening on an economic global scale, we need to get our capital out of traditional fiat currency and into what we would call a store of value. Hard assets. Real estate is one of those hard assets that we want to put our capital in, but we have to be responsible for it. How do I see the future? I think we're in for a hard landing. I think we're still maybe a year away from really feeling the effects. But ultimately, over the next few months, we're going to start to see the unemployment continue to ramp up, even though Bank of Canada will lower rates. And if Bank of Canada literally walked in tomorrow and lowered rates 75 basis points, again, because of the lag, all of that takes time. So depending on where you are in your thesis, depending on where you are in your own investment journey, when we look and start to understand that rates will be coming down, we can look at the deals that we're doing and be fairly confident that if we're using rates that are, let's say, 50% or 50%, 50 basis points lower, how does that math look for us? I think that's a fairly safe bet. Some of you may be more aggressive and go, no, I see it coming down a full percentage point. Then base your thesis on that, whatever you do. Here's the thing about it all. We have to look into the future and say, I've got a long-term vision of my real estate portfolio. I'm looking 5, 7, 10 years down the road. And we just know that when we consider what's happening, again, economically at a global scale and within Canada specifically, we'll do well to put our money into real estate, manage it, treat it like a business, and you'll do exceptionally well. We'll see how the economy does, but it's not looking good. That's for darn sure, short of some of our Western provinces. Alberta is a prime example of that. So if you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.